Joining us to discuss the looming rail strike and more is Vince Coglianese, Editorial Director of the Daily Caller. Vince, always great to see you. A lot to get to today, but first, we are just weeks away from Christmas with an economy already on the fritz. That said, what type of impact do you think a rail strike will have, especially now?
It would be devastating, completely devastating. If the railways stop moving freight in the United States of America, you've seen estimates of some 30% of all freight will stop moving, and that will create dramatic shortages and follow-on price increases, what we know as inflation, as people compete for more limited goods. It'll be a chaos. And so there's every incentive in the world right now for leaders in Washington to figure out a way to stop this, and quickly. There are means to do that. Congress can do that. And of course, the president of the United States would sign off on it. But that takes them showing some courage in order to shore up America's supply lines, which desperately need it right now in the midst of an already a struggling economy.
Yeah, and before the midterms, President Biden said in a 60 Minutes interview that he resolved the strike. But unfortunately, I mean, it looks like we're back at square one again. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, we knew actually at the time that Biden was making that claim that all they were doing was delaying negotiations until after the election. So they made that seem like that they had averted catastrophe when in reality they had only delayed it. And I got to say, I was disappointed in the coverage then. I was disappointed in the White House's claims then that they had somehow saved the country from this rail strike. Just not true. And in fact, in terms of the dishonesty in this past week, we heard from the White House that Joe Biden, President Biden, is, quote, directly involved in these negotiations. But then President Biden himself on Thanksgiving Day told reporters in Nantucket, no, he wasn't directly involved, that White House aides had been handling that. So there are more questions than answers, unfortunately, again, with something that could be an economic catastrophe.
Yeah, I want to stick with President Biden here. You know, his plan was to take a serious look at a 2024 run over the Thanksgiving break, which, as you mentioned, he was on the Tony Island of Nantucket at a friend's multi-million-dollar estate. What more do we know about this trip, Vince, and also this possible re-election bid?
We saw some reporting going into it that he was going to spend the time consulting with family about whether or not a 2024 run would be appropriate for him. It's not hard to see why that conversation would come up. He's the oldest president in American history. There are certainly questions about his capability to do it again. But on the other hand, the bench that the Democratic Party has kind of thin. I mean, right now, Kamala Harris, who's the vice president of the United States, is definitely not considered one of the favorites because she has a very low approval rating in the United States, just not well liked. And so plenty of Democrats have already indicated that if Joe Biden were not to run again, that this would be a pretty competitive primary. Nobody would just hand it over to Kamala Harris. So right now, Democrats have to figure out what they're going to do, and rather quickly, because that presidential election, it does feel like it's far away, but it's going to be upon us in no time. And certainly there are a bunch of Democrats who are waiting in the wings to find out whether or not Joe Biden is going to do it again.
Yeah, and Vince, a lot going on here in the United States and also around the world. Before I let you go, I want to discuss what's happening in China. As we mentioned earlier, protesters are pouring into the streets. They're fighting over those COVID restrictions. I'm curious, what do you think all these protests signal, and where do you think all this is going?
Well, it's a massive display of unrest in a country where the communist leadership has been able to stop such expressions in the past successfully. Less so this time. Xi Jinping is now in his third term as the communist leader of that country. He is trying to hold together billions of people who are becoming more and more discontented with the ongoing COVID lockdowns. There are unbelievable draconian measures being enforced against the people, from welding their doors shut to abandoning burning buildings for fear of sending firefighters in and exposing them to COVID, to locking Chinese citizens up inside of concentration camps. There is no end to the suffering that we know of. Nevertheless, the stuff that we don't know about inside of that closely kept country. So there's a lot of chaos right now, and I think it's spooking everyone from people who watch China from afar to Chinese people themselves, as well as the markets, which have become very dependent on Chinese manufacturing and goods. So we, again, wait to see what happens next.
And almost out of time. Very quickly, though, what else is on your radar, Vince?
We're going to be watching really closely the Anthony Fauci's departure. He just did a number of Sunday shows. The doctor who's been kind of really in charge of America's COVID response. If I could relate it to China for a moment, in a deposition he just gave this past week about the government's behavior through all of that, he did suggest that they were looking with envy towards China's lockdown policies very early in the pandemic. So if you're wondering why, in some cases, the United States reached unbelievable lockdown measures, including places like Michigan, where they roped off access to purchasing seeds for your garden, look no further than U.S. officials looking kindly upon some of those tyrannical behaviors we saw in other countries. I hope we learn some lessons from all this.
Absolutely, Vince. Always great to have you on and get your insights. Thank you so much.